In this video, we'll learn to turn the impossible into reality. In other words, we'll learn to make impossible chess moves. I'll challenge you to stop the video in critical positions and find them, after which it will be clear what qualities you need to have in order to make these moves. The moves in our game were made by Grandmaster Efim Geller, who had a positive score against the world champions Botvinnik, Smyslov, Petrosian and Fischer, and was known for his dynamic style. So let's see if you can find his impossible dynamic ideas in this game. Geller starts with d4 and his opponent, Paul Keres, plays the Nimzo Indian defense, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3 and bishop b4. Geller goes for e3. The idea is to prepare bishop d3, which will develop the bishop and take the important central e4 square under control. Keres plays b6, preparing the fianchetto of the bishop, which will put pressure on the long diagonal and challenge white's control over this crucial central square. After bishop d3, Keres castles, knight f3 followed, d5, increasing his control over the e4 square. Geller castles 2, bishop b7 followed, and nowadays in this position the main line for white is c takes d, but at that time bishop d2 was more popular. On the one hand, white defends his knight, so if black captures on c3, white wouldn't be forced to capture with a pawn anymore, which would damage his pawn structure. Instead, white of course will capture with the bishop, keeping his pawn structure intact. Besides that, by playing bishop d2, white has created an immediate threat of knight takes d5 with the discovered attack on the black bishop. And if after knight takes d5 black captures on d2, before recapturing the bishop, white first will exchange the knights with a tempo, with a check, and only after black captures on f6, white will capture the black bishop on d2 and win a pawn. To parry this threat, Keres exchanges on c4, and after bishop takes c4, he immediately attacks white's pawn center with c5. But the c5 pawn closes the retreating diagonal of the bishop, so Geller immediately attacks this bishop. Now he will get the advantage of two bishops. So black has two options here. He can either exchange on c3, and after bishop takes c3, black can play knight e4, attacking the bishop. Of course, black would love to exchange his knight for the bishop in order to deprive his opponent of the two bishops advantage, but white can play bishop e1 and the position would remain more or less equal. Or, instead of bishop takes c3, as was the case in our game, black can keep his bishop under attack and capture on d4, attacking the white knight in his turn. And after a takes b, that's exactly what happened in our game, black captures the knight, and after bishop takes c3, as you see, white has the advantage of two bishops. However, his pawn structure is damaged. He has doubled weak pawns on b2 and b4. On the other hand, in his turn, white has the open a-file, and his rook, without making a single move, has turned into an active piece and is attacking the weakness on a7. So, what should black do? Black still hasn't finished his development. His queenside isn't developed. And if black makes the most natural developing move knight c6, b5 might be quite unpleasant. Computer recommends in this position to avoid the exchange of the queens and play queen e7, and only then knight e4, which attacks the bishop, of course. But instead of queen e7, Keres plays knight e4 right away, which, as the game will show, was a dubious decision, because Geller exchanges the queens, and after rook takes d8, black is ready to capture the bishop, depriving his opponent of the two bishops advantage, but he doesn't have time to do it, because Geller makes a strong move, rook d1. Now, of course, black cannot capture the bishop because of rook takes d8 checkmate. And as the white rook has moved away from f1 to d1, white can play bishop e1. So on e1, the bishop will not close the rook's way anymore. So the king's rook is already developed, and white will retain the advantage of two bishops. So what should black do in this position now? If he develops if he makes the most natural move, knight c6, it turns out that white can simply capture on d8 and black cannot recapture with the rook. If he does that, he will lose his a7 pawn. White would first kick the knight out of c6, the knight is defending the pawn, and if the knight retreats to e7, then white would simply capture on a7, winning a pawn. Actually, black has no choice, he must retreat. If the knight retreats to a5, then of course black would capture on a5, destroying black's pawn structure. So after possible knight c6, rook d8, as rook takes d8 doesn't work, black would be forced to capture with the knight, but in this case white first saves his bishop. Of course, this bishop looks terrible at the moment, but white can activate this bishop later in the game, either by playing b5 and bishop b4, or after moving the knight from f3, he can play f3 and the bishop can be brought into play via g3. So in this position, white still has an advantage because his rook is very active, a7 is under pressure, black cannot develop his rook, the rook is tied to the defense of this pawn and white has retained the bishop pair. What else can black do? So knight c6 gives white some advantage. If black exchanges the rooks, then after rook takes d1, black still doesn't have time to capture the bishop as white is threatening checkmate, so black can try knight c6, but in this case again b5 can follow. Now if the knight retreats to e7, then white plays bishop b4, saving his bishop, and the bishop is very active, much more active than it was on e1 in the previous variation. Or if after rook d1, knight c6 and b5, instead of knight e7, black captures on c3, attacking the rook, white has an interesting possibility, tactical possibility, b takes c, attacking the bishop, sacrificing the exchange, but after knight takes d1, c takes b, although black is up the exchange, he has a lost position because the pawn is very strong. White can defend the pawn, and after possible knight takes b2, white plays knight e5, followed by either knight c6 or knight d7, which would attack the rook. White will capture this rook and will have an extra piece. For this reason, after rook d1, as neither knight c6 nor rook takes d1 works, Keres plays rook c8. Now, both white bishops are under attack, and it seems that white is losing this advantage. However, it isn't the case. Keres saves the dark squared bishop, and it turns out that black still cannot capture the light squared bishop, as rook d8 checkmate would follow. For this reason, Keres solves his back rank issues once and for all. He plays king f8, and now he is ready to capture this bishop. That's why rook d4. Not only defending the bishop, but also targeting the knight and preventing the development of black's queenside, so black cannot play knight c6, as on c6 the knight will close the bishop's diagonal and the knight would be lost. Besides that, of course, the rook also controls the d7 square, so black cannot develop the knight on d7 either. That's why, in order to finish his development, Keres plays king e7. Now the king controls this square and he is ready to play knight d7. But Geller prevents it one more time. He plays rook d1, doubling his rooks. Now knight d7 of course loses a piece. For this reason, Keres plays rook c7, again taking this square under control, and again he is ready to play knight c7, and if he manages to do it, he would finish his development and equalize. And we have reached the first critical position in this game. So what should white do? Of course, he should try to prevent black from developing his knight, from playing knight d7. And the most natural way of doing that would be knight e5, which of course looks like a great move. So the knight controls this square, black cannot develop his queenside. Besides that, by playing knight e5, white has vacated the f3 square, so he is ready to play f3, kicking black's best piece, the knight, away from the center. Besides that, at the moment his worst piece is the bishop, which is restricted by its own pawns, but after white plays f3, his bishop will be activated and it will become a great piece. However, unfortunately, this move, knight e5, which is otherwise a great move, doesn't work, because after knight e5, black can play f6, kicking the knight out of this square, and after the knight retreats, let's say it returns to its square, to f3, black can play e5, kicking out the rook from d4, and the rook is the only defender of the bishop, and after the rook retreats, black simply wins a piece. So what should white do in this position? Knight e5 doesn't work. How should he prevent black from finishing his development? You can pause the video and try to find Geller's brilliant idea. I'm sorry for tricking you, but in my opinion that was the most effective way of illustrating the point, how to make impossible moves. Whenever you see a strong move, but at the same time you see the possible refutation of this move, don't reject your strong move too early, especially if you have an advantage, if you have the initiative, as white does in this position. Calculate further, and maybe your initiative will let you find some additional tactical possibilities and turn the impossible into reality. And that's exactly what Geller does. At first sight, knight e5 is impossible on account of f6, but Geller didn't stop his calculations and he found a brilliant idea. He still plays knight e5, preventing knight d7 and threatening f3 followed by bishop g3. So black has no choice. He must play f6. But what now? We already mentioned that if the knight retreats, black will play e5, kicking out the rook and capturing the bishop. So now that you know that the knight e5 was the move, you can pause the video one more time and try to find Geller's follow-up. So instead of moving the knight, his great central knight, Geller saves his bishop, which is under attack. So he plays bishop d3, on the one hand saving the bishop, on the other hand, which is very important, attacking the knight for the second time. And it turns out that if black captures the knight, which would also attack the rook, so white cannot capture the knight with the bishop, but Geller prepared rook takes e4. Black has no choice, he must capture the rook, otherwise he will stay with the terrible pawn structure and would have strategically hopeless position. But after bishop takes e4, black is currently up the exchange, but his rook is under attack. So the weakness of this diagonal would tell. The weakness of the diagonal and the poor development of black pieces, of black queenside would tell. The only move to save the rook would be knight c6, but the knight would be pinned on this diagonal. And when the piece is pinned, the best thing to do is to attack it with a pawn, of course. So b5 would follow. The knight cannot move, as the rook would fall. Black can try his last chance, rook d8, attacking the white rook in his turn. Of course, if white exchanges, that would be a terrible mistake, because black would recapture with the knight, saving his material, but instead of rook takes d8, white would play rook c1, pinning the knight one more time, this time vertically. And next move, white would capture the knight and would get two bishops for the rook with an absolutely winning position. So Geller didn't stop his calculations and he found this fantastic idea. So bishop d3 followed. And of course, Keres also calculated everything and he realized that f takes e doesn't work. For this reason, he saves his knight, which is under attack. He plays knight d6. And we have reached the second critical position. So what should white do? His knight is still under attack, and if he moves his knight, if the knight retreats, black will finish his development and equalize. But what if, instead of moving the knight, white captures the unguarded pawn. So at first sight, it's a great idea. After bishop takes d3, white not only captures the pawn, but also, as the bishop has moved away from d3, the rook's way is open and both white rooks are attacking the knight. And after f takes e, white can capture this knight. But in this case, black can play bishop d5, breaking the communication between the rooks, and the d6 rook would be trapped. So, unfortunately, after knight d6, bishop takes h7 doesn't work. So you can pause the video and try to find Geller's brilliant idea. What to do? The knight is under attack. So now that you know how to turn the impossible into reality, I hope you didn't trust me this time and you calculated further. So bishop takes h7 is actually possible. Geller plays it. Bishop takes h7. F takes e followed, rook takes d6, bishop d5, and Geller didn't stop his calculations at this point. He finds the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes d5. And after e takes d, rook takes d5. Black is up the exchange. But for the exchange, white has two pawns. Besides that, his weaknesses can be easily defended. The bishop can defend both of these pawns. Besides that, from c3, the bishop will attack both pawns, the e5 pawn and indirectly the g7 pawn. And these pawns are weak, while white doesn't have any weaknesses in his position. And if these pawns, these black pawns, fall, white will have connected passed pawns which will be unstoppable. But let's see what happens next. Keres activates his rook, threatening to capture with a checkmate. That's why king f1 followed. And finally, Keres gets a chance to develop his queenside. Knight c6, attacking the b4 pawn, as the bishop isn't really defending it, as the bishop is pinned. That's why king e2, unpinning the bishop and defending the pawn. And now it might seem that black can play rook h8, attacking the bishop, and after the bishop retreats, black can win a pawn. But it doesn't work, because in this case, as you see at the moment, the bishop is white's worst piece, which is restricted by its own pawns, but white can play b5 with a tempo, vacating the b4 square for his bishop, and that would be deadly. After the knight retreats, let's say to a5, the bishop is brought into play with great effect, with a check, and the e5 pawn is also under attack, so the most logical move would be king f6 to defend the pawn, but rook d6 check can follow, and after king f7, bishop g6 check, so both bishops together with the rook initiate a terrible attack on the black king. The king cannot retreat to the g8 square because of rook d8 checkmate, so he must move to the dark square, and on this square, of course, the bishop the king would be a target of attack of this great bishop. After rook c6, the discovered check, and next move, white would capture the unguarded c1 rook. For this reason, as rook h8 doesn't work, Keres plays rook d8 in order to exchange white's active rook. Geller exchanges the rooks, and after knight takes d8, he activates his bad bishop. Now, this bishop is transformed and it becomes white's best piece. And it also turns out that although black is up the exchange, his rook isn't doing anything. It isn't effective because it doesn't have any targets of attack, while the white bishops are very strong and there is no way black can save his pawns. So king e6 followed, defending the e5 pawn, but Geller plays first. He plays bishop g8 check, and after king d6 he plays f4, threatening to capture on e5. So black must capture, but now the bishop's diagonal is open, and after e takes f, there is no way black can defend his pawn, the g7 pawn. If it moves forward, white can attack it with the light squared bishop and it will fall anyways. That's why Keres activates his knight and temporarily defends the pawn. But of course, white can capture the knight, removing the defender at any moment, followed by bishop takes g7. But Geller isn't in a hurry. First he plays bishop e5 check, and only after king d5, as the knight is pinned now, he, even without exchanging his bishop for the knight, captures on g7. Now he has 3 connected passed pawns. Rook c8 followed, attacking the bishop, and only now Geller exchanges. And after king takes e6, he plays king f3, rook c4, attacking the b4 pawn, bishop c3, defending it, king d5, and the h pawn starts its march. a5 followed. Keres tries his last chance. B takes a. Now, of course, if black recaptures, white would capture this pawn too. That's why Keres plays rook takes c3 check in order to create a passed pawn after b takes a. However, by playing king e3, white could have stopped this pawn, but Geller goes for h5. It turns out that if black plays a4, after both sides promote to the queen, white has a simple tactics, c4 check with the discovered attack on the black queen, winning her. That's why after h5, Keres plays king e6, but after king e3, the pawn is stopped and Keres resigned. And now I recommend watching Geller's attacking masterpiece, where he achieves his highest chess ideal. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.